Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy.
This episode is brought to you by Prime. Obsession is in session, and this summer, Prime Originals have everything you want. Steamy romances, irresistible love stories, and the book-to-screen favorites you've already read twice. Off Campus, Elle, Every Year After, The Love Hypothesis, Sterling Point, and more. Slow burns, second chances, chemistry you can feel through the screen. Your next obsession is waiting. Watch only on Prime.
Sierra has all the best active and outdoor brands for the super athletic stuff, like running gear for cruising up the trail. Woo! And the super athletic-ish stuff, like fishing gear for chilling by the creek. Nice cast. Fitness apparel to push for higher reps. You got this. And golf balls priced so you can afford to lose one. Or a few. Head to Sierra or Sierra.com for the brands you want at the prices that let you do it all. From athletic to athletic-ish, Sierra's got it.
Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from The Secret of Toni, written by Molly Elliot Seawell and published in 1911. This story is about a young man named Toni who uncovers a hidden family secret. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those of you who are new to the podcast, you may not know that it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we've built together. The podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with the support from subscribers and patrons on Patreon, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. If you would like, you can always subscribe to the show by clicking on the link in the show notes. This also creates for an ad-free experience while supporting podcast creation. Another way to connect with the show is simply by leaving a comment in your app. If you would like to say hello to me, you can do that by visiting boytosleep.com. You can also drop a comment in the app by letting me know your location. It's great to hear from listeners wherever you are in the world. If you know someone who needs a good night's rest, you're always welcome to share this podcast with them. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. The Secret of Toni by Molly Elliot Seawell. Chapter 1. Toni's name was Antoine Marcel, but he was never called by it once in his life, and that was at his baptism, when he was 8 days old. He had a shock of black hair and a snub nose, and the tan and freckles on his face were an inch thick, but he had a pair of black eyes so soft and bright and appealing that they might have belonged to one of the heiresses of paradise. His wide mouth was full of sharp, white teeth, and when he smiled, which was very often, his smile began with his black eyes and ended with his white teeth. At 10 years of age, Toni was a complete man of the world. Of his world, that is. This consisted of a happy, sunny little old garrison town, Bienville by name, in the south of France. He had his friends, his foes, his lady love, and he had also arranged his plan of life. He knew himself to be the most fortunate person in all Bienville. In the first place, his mother, Madame Marcel, kept the only candy shop in the town, and Toni, being the only child of his mother, and she a widow, enjoyed all the advantages of this envied position. The advocate's son, to make him go to school when he would rather lie on his stomach in the meadow down by the river, and watch the butterflies dancing in the sun and the foolish bumblebees stumbling like drunkards among the clover blossoms. Paul Verney was his best friend, that is except Jacques. Toni, owing to his exceptional position as the only son of the house of Marcel, candy manufacturer, would have had no lack of friends among boys of his own age. But he was afraid of other boys except Paul Verney. This was pure cowardice on Toni's part, because, although short for his age, he was well built and had as good legs and arms as was well able to take care of himself as any boy in Bienville. Paul Verney was a pink-cheeked, clean, well-set-up boy 2 years older than Toni, and as industrious as Toni was idle, as anxious to learn as Toni was determined not to learn, as honest with his father, the lawyer, as Toni was unscrupulous with his mother about the amount of candy he consumed, and as full of quiet courage with other boys as Toni was arrant and shameless poltroon about some things. Toni was classed as a bad boy, and Paul Verney as a good boy, yet the two formed one of those strange kinships of the soul, which are stronger than blood ties and last as long as life itself. Toni, being of a shrewd and discerning mind, realized that Paul Verney would have loved him just as much if Madame Marcel had not kept a candy shop, and this differentiated from all the other boys in Bienville. And although Paul often severely reprobated Toni, and occasionally gave him kicks and cuffs, which Toni could have resented but did not, he had no fear whatever of Paul. Toni's other friends, Jacques was a soldier. Jacques was about 3 inches high and was made of tin. He had once been a very smart soldier, with red trousers and an imposing shako, and a musket as big as himself, but the paint had been worn off the trousers and shako long ago, and as for the musket, only the butt remained. Jacques lived in Toni's pocket, and he was even more intimate with him than with Paul Verney. There were seasons when Paul Verney's kicks and cuffs caused a temporary estrangement from him on Toni's part, but there was never any estrangement between Toni and Jacques. Jacques never remonstrated with Toni, never contradicted him, never wanted any share of the candy which Toni abstracted under his mother's nose and ran down in the meadow to munch. There were some things Toni could say to Jacques that he could not say to any human being in the world, not even to Paul Verney, and Jacques never showed the least surprise or disgust. It is a great thing to have a perfectly complacent, unvarying friend, always close to one, and such was Jacques to Toni. Toni had heard something about the war, which occurred a long time ago, when the soldiers went a great way off from Bienville to a place called Russia, where it was very cold. In Tony's mind, Jacques had been to that place, and that where he lost the red paint of his trousers, and the barrel of his musket. Tony had a way of talking to Jacques, and imagined that Jacques talked back to him, a notion which, when Tony repeated what Jacques had said to him, Paul Verney thought quite ridiculous. Jacques told Tony long stories about that cold place called Russia. Tony knew that there was another place, very hot, called Algeria, and Jacques had been there too. Jacques had been everywhere that the soldiers had been, and he had told Tony long tales about these places in the summer nights, when Tony was in his little bed under the roof with the stars peeping in roguishly at the window, and Madame Marcel's tongue and knitting needles clacking steadily downstairs at the open door of the shop. And on winter days, when Tony left home for school and changed his mind and went snowballing instead, Jacques encouraged him by telling him that it was very like Russia. Tony also found another use for Jacques, when he wished to say things which his mother occasionally and properly cuffed him for. He could talk it all out with Jacques. This seemed supremely absurd to Paul Verney and the other boys in the neighbourhood, notably the 5 sons of Clary, the tailor, who jeered at Tony when they discovered his relations with Jacques. But Tony was as insensible to ridicule as to reproof. The only thing that really moved him was when his mother had rheumatism and her knees swelled. Then Tony would cry as if his heart would break, the big tears running down his dirty face as he sobbed and buried his fists in his hair, and would not be comforted, even though his mother could sit in her chair by the stove, and stir the candy kettle, and would give him the kettle to lick, after she had poured the candy out. But this was never more than once or twice a year, and the rest of the time Tony was as happy and as free from care as the birdlings in spring that sang under the linden trees in the park. Tony had already arranged a marriage of convenience for himself, which was the most advantageous description. Across the street from Madame Marcel's shop was the baking establishment of Mademoiselle Duval and Denise. The niece and idol of Mademoiselle Duval was just 2 years younger than Tony, and as pretty as a pink and white bonbon. In fact, she looked not unlike a bonbon. She had very pink cheeks and very blue eyes, and a long plait of yellow hair like the yellow candy of molasses which Madame Marcel made every Saturday morning. Denise was as correct as Tony was incorrect. She always said, "Oui, monsieur," and "Non, madame," in the sweetest little voice imaginable, with her eyes cast down and her plump hands crossed before her. Not a hair of her blonde head was ever out of place, and the blue-checked apron which extended from her neck to her heels was as speckless as the white muslin frock she wore in church on Sundays. She was the most obedient of children, and Madame Marcel, when she wept and scolded Tony for his numerous misdeeds, often told him that she wished he were only half as good as Denise Duval, who had never disobeyed her aunt in her life. Tony smiled mysteriously whenever his mother said this, and chuckled inwardly at something known only to Jacques and himself, namely that when he grew to be a man he meant to marry Denise. What could be better than the combination of a candy shop and a cook shop and a bakery? And then there were other advantages connected with the match. Many of the little girls that Toni knew had large and dangerous-looking fathers, some of them soldiers with fierce mustaches, and these fathers sometimes kicked and cuffed idle little boys who should have been at school or at home instead of lying in the meadow or loitering upon the bench under the acacia tree by Mademoiselle Duval's shop, inhaling the delicious odours of the bakery kitchen. Denise had a father who was, indeed, large and dangerous-looking, and was a soldier too, nay, a sergeant, and had the fiercest moustache Toni had ever seen. But he only came to Bienville once a year for a few days on his annual leave, and seemed to Toni a most irrational and singular person. For although he could, if he wished, have eaten all the cakes in his sister's shop, Toni never saw him so much as look at one of them. On this annual reappearance of Sergeant Duval, Toni kept carefully out of the way. Once, when he was hiding under the counter of the shop, he had overheard the sergeant asking Madame Marcel why she did not make the little rascal of hers go to school, and when Madame Marcel, a pretty, plump widow of 40, tearfully admitted that she could not, of herself, manage Toni, the sergeant promptly offered to give Toni a good thrashing as a favour to Madame Marcel. This Madame Marcel, in a panic, declined, and then the sergeant made a proposition still more shocking to Toni's feelings. "Then why, madame," he said gallantly, twirling his moustache, "do you not marry again? If I were young and handsome enough, I should offer myself, and then, I warrant you, I would make that young rogue of yours behave himself." Whether this were an offer or not, Madame Marcel could not determine. She might have fancied the dashing, fierce-looking sergeant with his 5 medals on his breast, but that proposition to thrash Toni robbed the proposal of all its charm. And besides that, Madame Marcel, although she praised Denise, felt a secret jealousy of the little girl's perfections. Toni, as a rule, was less afraid of soldiers than any other people, especially if they were cavalrymen, for Toni dearly loved horses and was not the least cowardly about them, and felt a secret bond of sympathy between himself and all who had to do with the cult of the horse. Bienville had been a place of considerable military consequence in the old far-off days, and still retained evidences of having had 10,000 troops quartered there in long rows of tumble-down barrack buildings. But not much remained of this former consequence except the old barracks, a hideous war monument in the public square, and a very grim old woman, the widow of a soldier, in the Napoleonic Wars. Toni regarded the monument of old Marie in her mob cap and spectacles, sitting proud and stern on a bench in the public square, as belonging to each other. All the soldiers and even the officers saluted old Marie as they passed, tributes which were received with proud composure. Everything else in the town of Bienville was gay and cheerful, except the monument and old Marie. It was now garrisoned by 1 cavalry regiment only, and was a depot for horses and cavalry recruits. There was a big riding school with a tan-bark floor, where the new recruits were broken in and taught to ride. It was Toni's delight to crawl in by the window or the small side door, and hiding under the pile of horse furniture in a corner, watch the horses gallop around, their hoofs beating softly on the tan bark, their eyes bright and glistening, their crests up and their coats shining like satin, with much currying at the hands of brawny troopers. Toni did not know what it was to be afraid of a horse, and loved nothing better than to hang around the barracks stables and riding school, and take cheerfully the cuffs and kicks he got from the soldiers for being in the way. Especially was this true on Sundays, where he did not have Paul Verney's company, for Paul went to church obediently, while Toni, after submitting to be washed and dressed clean, was almost certain to run away, disregarding his mother's frantic cries after him, and spent the whole morning in the delightful precincts of the barracks stables. Jacques liked it too, and told Toni it reminded him of those glorious old days, when his trousers and shako were new, and he carried his musket jauntily in the long red line that set out for Russia. So Toni haunted the barrack stables to please Jacques as well as himself. One glorious and never-to-be-forgotten day, a good-natured trooper had hoisted Toni on the back of a steady-going old charger, who knew as much about teaching recruits to ride as any soldier in the regiment. The old charger, being offended at finding the small, wriggling object upon his back, took it into his head, for the first time since his colthood, to plunge and kick violently, and ended by bolting out of the barracks yard and making straight across the edge of the town, through the meadow to the old stone bridge that spanned the river. The trooper, who had meant to oblige Toni, suddenly realized that the boy was the only son of his mother, and she a widow. Jumping on another horse, he galloped after Toni, down the stony street, into the green lane and across the bridge. The old charger, who was 18 years old, gave out at the end of the bridge and came down to a sober trot. He had not, with all his efforts, got rid of the small wriggling object on his back. As for Toni, he had the time of his life. It was the one full draught of riotous joy that he had tasted. It was better even than licking the candy kettle on Saturday mornings. The wild flight through the air, as it seemed to Toni, the snorting breath of the old charger, the delicious sense of bumping up and down lifted him into an ecstasy. When the trooper came up, the horse was sedately browsing by the wayside, and Toni, with his arms clasped around the horse's neck and his black head down on his mane, was in a little heaven of his own. The trooper, who had expected to find Toni lying by the roadside mangled, was immensely relieved and swore at him out of pure joy, and as a reward for not having got his neck broken, allowed Toni to ride the old charger back into the town. This was not to be compared with that wild flight through space, that glorious bumping up and down, that sense of delight in feeling the horse panting under him, but it was something. Toni, trotting soberly home, concluded that he would not tell his mother, but was meant to tell Jacques all about it, and putting his hand in his pocket, Jacques was not there. Oh, what agony was Toni's then! He burst into a fit of weeping and rushing back to the riding school. Crawled around frantically everywhere the troopers would let him go, searching for his loved and lost Jacques. The story of his ride had got out by that time, and he was not kicked and cuffed when he searched. With streaming eyes and loud sobs for his dearly loved Jacques. But Jacques could not be found, not even along the stone street, nor by the lanes, nor across the old stone bridge, and the day grew dark to Toni. He searched all day and when he went home at night and told his mother of his loss, Madame Marcel wept too. It was no good to promise him a whole company of tin soldiers. They were only tin soldiers, but Jacques was his friend, his confidant, his other self, his oversoul. Toni cried himself to sleep that night. It was so lonely up in the little garret without Jacques. And Toni knew that Jacques was lonely without him. Toni pictured poor Jacques alone and forlorn, lost in the tanbark, or trampled underfoot in the street, or floating down the darkling river, or perhaps being chewed up by the goats that browsed on the other side of the bridge. In the middle of the night, Madame Marcel was awakened by Toni's groans and cries. "Oh, Mama, Mama," he cried, "how lonely Jacques must be. What is he thinking of now? He has no musket to take care of himself. Oh, Mama." And then Toni howled again. The next day Toni was up at dawn searching for his beloved. He searched all the morning, but he could not find the lost one. When he came home to dinner at 12 o'clock, he met Paul Verney, and Paul saw by Toni's woebegone look and tear-stained face that some calamity had befallen him. Toni had looked forward with triumphant pleasure to telling Paul about that wild ride on the old horse's back, but he could give it no thought. Paul was kind and sympathetic and understood Toni's sorrow, which was of some little comfort to the bereaved one. While the two boys sat together on the bench under the acacia tree, close to Madame Marcel's shop, up came little Denise, as neat and pink and white as ever. One of her hands was closed, and as she approached Toni, she said in the sweetest small voice in the world, "Toni, is this yours? I found it in the street." And opening her little hand, oh joy, there was Jacques. His shako a little crooked, one of his legs out of plumb, but it was Jacques. Toni, without words or thanks, seized Jacques and, rushing off, flew to his favourite spot for mediation, a little corner on one of the abutments of the old stone bridge. Once there, he kissed Jacques and held him to his breast, and told him of the heartbreaking search made for him, and Jacques, as usual, was silently sympathetic, and understood all that Toni had suffered. Meanwhile, Paul Verney, ashamed for Toni's want of manners, is not thanking Denise, and all unaware of the great wave of gratitude that was surging through Toni's whole being, went into the shop and told Madame Marcel of Toni's good fortune. Madame Marcel was so overjoyed that she not only invited Paul to help himself to whatever he wanted in the way of sweets, but ran out and, catching Denise in her arms, kissed her and brought her into the shop and invited her, as she had invited Paul Verney, to select what she wished. Denise, with characteristic modesty, took 2 small sticks of candy, but Madame Marcel gave her, as well as Paul, a large bag of very beautiful bonbons. It was late in the afternoon before Toni appeared, his eyes shining like the stars that peeped in at his little window, his wide mouth showing all his white teeth. Madame Marcel took him by the hand, and they went over with state and ceremony to thank Denise for restoring the loved and lost Jacques. Toni felt indignant that Mademoiselle Duval, a tall, thin, elderly, heartless maiden lady, should laugh at Jacques when Toni displayed him, and tell Madame Marcel she could have bought a couple of boxes of tin soldiers for one half the bonbons she had given Denise. But Toni had known all the time that very few grown people know anything about boys, and was simply filled with contempt for Mademoiselle Duval. She was thin and ugly too, not round and plump like his own mother, and had the bad taste to prefer clean, well-mannered little girls to dirty and greedy boys. Up to that time, Toni's feelings toward Denise had been purely of a mercenary character. But from the day she restored Jacques, a little seedling sentiment sprang up in Toni's heart. The great master of all passions had planted it there. It was something like he had felt for Paul Verney, a sense of well-being, even of protection when Denise was near. She had acted the part of a guardian angel. She had restored Jacques to him, and she did not seem to mind his dirty face and grimy hands. She acquired a bewitching habit of dividing with Toni the stale apple tarts her aunt gave her, and beckoning to him across the street. She would have to sit by her on the bench under the acacia tree, and always give him at least 2/3 of the tarts. A few days after the tragedy of Jacques' loss and return, Sergeant Duval, Denise's father, appeared for his annual visit to Bienville. The story of Jacques was told to him, and when he came over to pay his call of ceremony on Madame Marcel, he was so rude as to twit Toni about Jacques. Toni, much displeased at this, retired to his usual place of refuge under the counter, and concluded that when he married Denise he would contrive to be absent during Sergeant Duval's annual visit. Paul Verney was 12 years old, and had never had any affairs of the heart like Toni. But one June afternoon, in the same summer when Toni had lost and recovered Jacques, and had succumbed to the tender passion, fate overtook Paul Verney in the person of Lucy Bernard, the prettiest little creature imaginable, prettier even than Denise, and very unlike that small piece of perfection. Paul, who was very fond of reading, took his book, which happened to be an English one, to the park that afternoon of fate, and was sitting on a bench, laboriously puzzling over the English language, when a beautiful little girl in blue, with a gigantic sash and large pale blue hat, with roses blushing all over it, under which her dark hair fell to her waist, came composedly up to him and said, "Let me see your book." Paul was so astonished at being addressed by a young lady, under the circumstances, that he promptly handed over his book, and Lucy, seating herself on the bench, proceeded to read it. Paul was surprised to see that the English book, through which he had been painfully spelling his way, seemed perfectly easy to Lucy, who, without a moment's hesitation, read on, remarkably casually to Paul. "I can read English as well as I can read French. My mother was an American, you know, and Americans speak English." Paul did not know the piece of family history thus confided to him, nor indeed did he know anything about this little nymph. But he thought in his honest little heart that she was the most charming vision his boyish eyes had ever rested on. He admired her dainty little slippers, her silk stockings, her general air of fashion, but blushed at finding himself sitting on the same bench with her, particularly as he saw his father, the grey-haired advocate, Monsieur Paul Verney, approaching. He was just about to sneak away, leaving his book in the hands of the fair brigand, when a fierce-looking English nursery governess suddenly descended upon them, and seizing Lucy by the arm, carried her off. The governess threw Paul's book down on the gravel path, and Paul picked it up. Somehow, the book seemed to have a different aspect after being held in the charming little fairy's hands. Paul was possessed by a wholly new set of emotions. He longed to tell someone of this startling adventure. A little girl planting herself on the bench by him and taking his book from him without the least embarrassment or even apology. What very strange little girls must those be whose mothers were American. Paul had plenty of friends among the boys of his own age and class, and among his schoolmates, but he never confided in any of them as he did in Toni Marcel. So presently, wandering down by the bridge where he was certain to find Toni at this hour of the day, he saw his friend perched in the little cranny, which he called his own, on the bridge above the dark and rippling water. 2 small boys could be squeezed into this place, and Paul Verney, climbing up, sat side by side with Toni, with his arm round his friend's neck, bashfully but delightedly told Toni and Jacques, who of course heard everything that was told to Toni, all about the beautiful dreamlike creature he had seen in the park. Then Toni said, without any bashfulness at all, "I have got a sweetheart too. It is Denise. Some day I am going to marry her, and in the morning we will eat candy at Mamma's shop, and in the afternoon we will eat cakes at Mademoiselle Duval's shop." And that concludes tonight's readings. If you're not quite tired yet, you're always welcome to listen to another episode of the Boy to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.